Chapter 14, The Unhealed Wounds, a Scarred World Waiting for the Next Explosion. The armistice of November 11, 1918, silenced the guns, but it did not end the war. The peace that followed was not a healing balm, but a poison chalice, its bitter draught leaving behind a world riddled with unhealed wounds. The Great War had not only reshaped borders and brought down empires, it had fundamentally altered economies, unleashed unprecedented social traumas, and created a volatile political landscape ripe for exploitation by new, dangerous ideologies. The illusion that a stable future could be built on such a foundation was perhaps the ultimate big lie. The world, profoundly scarred, was not at peace, but merely paused, a ticking time bomb awaiting the next, inevitable explosion. The economic hangover, war debts, hyperinflation, and global depression. The Great War left behind an economic landscape utterly devastated by 4 years of unprecedented spending, borrowing, and destruction. Far from bringing stability, the post-war financial arrangements destabilized the world economy, creating an insidious economic hangover that would haunt the interwar period. The vicious cycle, reparations, loans, and the looming crash. The financial architecture of the peace was inherently flawed and unsustainable. The European Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, owed vast sums, billions of dollars, to the United States, which had emerged as the world's leading creditor nation. Simultaneously, Germany was obligated to pay crippling reparations to these same allies to compensate for war damages, a figure ultimately set at an astronomical £6.6 billion. This created a perilous vicious cycle. The Allies needed German reparations to repay their war debts to the US. If Germany failed to pay, the entire system risked collapse, threatening global financial stability. The big lie that the immense costs of war could be simply shifted and managed without long-term systemic consequences was brutally exposed. The flow of capital was distorted, international trade suffered, and financial markets remained fragile, constantly teetering on the brink of a major crisis. This precarious edifice would ultimately buckle, leading directly to the global economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. Germany's economic nightmare, the hyperinflation crisis. Nowhere was the economic devastation more stark than in Germany, where the burden of reparations, coupled with post-war economic mismanagement, led to a catastrophic hyperinflation crisis in 1923. Faced with mounting reparations demands and dwindling foreign currency reserves, the German government resorted to printing vast quantities of money to meet its obligations and finance domestic spending. The result was an economic nightmare. The value of the German mark plummeted at an astonishing rate. Prices changed by the hour. Savings were wiped out overnight. In 1923, a loaf of bread could cost millions, then billions, of marks. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to spend their wages before they became worthless. People used banknotes as kindling or wallpaper. This devastating crisis annihilated the savings of the middle class, created widespread poverty, and fueled immense social and political unrest. It fundamentally eroded public faith in the fledgling Weimar Republic and its democratic institutions, making the population ripe for radical solutions and feeding the big lie that Germany was being deliberately destroyed by external forces. Seeds of tyranny, the rise of extreme ideologies. The widespread economic chaos, coupled with profound national humiliation and political instability, created a fertile breeding ground for extreme ideologies. In the ruins of old empires, new forms of authoritarianism rose, promising order, national rebirth, and simple, often violent, solutions. The Weimar Republic's struggle, democracy on the brink. Germany's new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, born from the ashes of the Kaiser's empire, was cursed from its inception. It was inextricably linked in the public mind with the humiliating defeat in the war and the diktat of the Treaty of Versailles. Lacking a strong democratic tradition and widespread public support, it faced immense challenges from both the extreme left, communist uprisings like the Spartacist uprising, and the extreme right, nationalist coup attempts like the Kapp Putsch and Hitler's Beer Hall Putsch. Political violence was rampant, and the economic crises, especially hyperinflation and mass unemployment, fueled deep public disillusionment. Many Germans yearned for the perceived stability and strength of authoritarian leadership, making them increasingly susceptible to the promises of extremist movements. The big lie that a fragile democracy, forced upon a defeated nation, could easily thrive amid such turmoil proved tragically false. Mussolini's march, the birth of fascism in Italy. Even among the victorious Allies, the war's aftermath sowed discontent. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated by the peace treaties, believing it had been denied promised territorial gains, a mutilated victory. Coupled with severe economic hardship, high unemployment, and widespread social unrest, strikes, land occupations, this created an environment ripe for a new, revolutionary ideology. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist, tapped into this frustration, offering a potent blend of fervent nationalism, promises of law and order, and a return to past national glory. His paramilitary black shirt suppressed political opponents with violence, and by 1922, his movement had gained enough momentum for the symbolic March on Rome, which effectively brought him to power. Mussolini established the first fascist state, demonstrating a chilling blueprint for other disillusioned nations on how a charismatic leader could seize control by exploiting post-war grievances and the big lie that only an authoritarian leader could restore national pride and stability. Russia's bloody birth, civil war and the rise of communism. For Russia, the Great War had been the ultimate catalyst for revolution and internal conflict. The immense strain of the war, economic collapse, and popular discontent directly led to the downfall of the Tsarist regime and the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The immediate aftermath of Russia's withdrawal from the war was plunged into a brutal civil war, 1918 to 1922, between the Bolshevik Reds and the anti-Bolshevik Whites, supported, albeit inconsistently, by Allied intervention. This conflict, even more devastating than Russia's participation in World War I, ultimately resulted in a Red victory and the consolidation of power under Vladimir Lenin and, later, Joseph Stalin. The war had thus paved the way for the emergence of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, the world's first communist state and an ideological adversary that would fundamentally reshape global geopolitics for the next 70 years, challenging the very notion of liberal democracy. Hitler's shadow, how World War I fueled the Nazi rise. Of all the tyrannical seeds planted by the Great War, none would grow into a more destructive force than Adolf Hitler and his Nazi ideology. Hitler himself was a veteran of World War I, deeply scarred by Germany's defeat and the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. His entire political program was a direct, vengeful response to the war's outcome. Nazism capitalized on Germany's deep sense of humiliation and economic despair. Hitler's central promises resonated profoundly with a population that felt betrayed: the abolition of the hated Treaty of Versailles, the rejection of the war guilt lie of Article 231, and the dismantling of reparations. He skillfully exploited the stab-in-the-back myth, blaming Jews, communists, and the Weimar politicians for Germany's defeat. Hitler's vision offered a fervent promise of national rebirth, racial purity, and a return to perceived glory, appealing to millions who felt economically ruined and spiritually broken. The Great War did not directly create Nazism, but it created the perfect storm of grievances, disillusionment, and instability that allowed a fringe ideology to become a mass movement, setting the stage for the next global conflict. The lost generation, trauma, cynicism, and a world forever changed. Beyond the political and economic upheavals, the war left an indelible, deeply personal mark on an entire generation, forever altering psychological landscapes and cultural expressions. This was the era of the lost generation, a term coined by Gertrude Stein to describe the profound sense of disorientation and cynicism felt by those who came of age during or immediately after the Great War. Shell shock's legacy: the invisible wounds of war. While the physical wounds of war were horrific, the invisible wounds, the lasting psychological impact, were even more pervasive. Shell shock, as it was then known, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, affected millions of veterans across all armies. Soldiers suffered from tremors, paralysis, memory loss, nightmares, uncontrollable anxieties, and profound depression. Often dismissed as cowardice or malingering during the war, its devastating reality became undeniable afterwards. Many veterans found it impossible to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and the constant threat they had endured. Society struggled to comprehend or provide adequate care for these damaged men, who often faced stigma and isolation. The big lie that courage alone could protect one from the psychological ravages of industrialized slaughter was laid bare, leaving a generation of men who were physically home, but spiritually adrift. A society in mourning, the cultural shift of a devastated generation. The collective trauma of the war led to a profound cultural shift. The romanticized notions of glory, heroism, and national destiny that had predated 1914 were shattered, replaced by a deep sense of cynicism, disillusionment, and absurdity. This shift was vividly reflected in art, literature, and philosophy. Writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Eric Maria Remarque, whose All Quiet on the Western Front became a seminal anti-war novel, explored themes of futility, despair, and the spiritual emptiness left by the conflict. Modernism flourished in the arts, with its rejection of traditional forms and embrace of fragmented, often unsettling, aesthetics. Philosophers grappled with the apparent collapse of moral order and meaning. Society, in a sense, was in collective mourning, struggling to reconcile the immense sacrifice with the bitter reality of the post-war world. Monuments to sorrow, how nations remembered, and forgot. The sheer scale of death necessitated new forms of remembrance. The interwar period saw the proliferation of war memorials in every village, town, and city across the belligerent nations, simple stone cenotaphs, obelisks, and statues bearing the names of the fallen. This stark inventory of loss, rather than triumphalist statues, reflected the pervasive grief that touched almost every family. The concept of the tomb of the unknown soldier/warrior emerged in various countries, France, Britain, US, Italy, becoming potent symbols of collective grief for the unidentifiable dead and the anonymous sacrifice of millions. The nature of remembrance evolved, oscillating between initial glorification of sacrifice and a later, more somber and questioning commemoration of the senseless brutality. This ongoing tension between celebrating heroism and confronting the brutal, senseless reality of the war was another big lie that society struggled to navigate. Reshaping the globe, new borders, old grievances. The peace treaties, while ostensibly designed to bring order, fundamentally reshaped the global political map in ways that often created more problems than they solved, leaving a legacy of new borders and old grievances that would directly fuel future conflicts. The birth of nations, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and more. From the ashes of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, a swath of new nations emerged in Central and Eastern Europe, ostensibly based on the principle of national self-determination. Poland was reborn after over a century of partition. Czechoslovakia, uniting Czechs and Slovaks, and Yugoslavia, uniting Southern Slavs, were created. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania gained independence from Russia. However, the reality of Europe's complex ethnic map meant that every new nation contained significant ethnic minorities, e.g., Germans in Czechoslovakia, Hungarians in Romania, Croats and Serbs within Yugoslavia. These minorities often faced discrimination and became sources of internal instability and international tension, ripe for exploitation by aggressive powers seeking to expand their influence. The big lie that national self-determination could be neatly applied without creating new injustices and irredentist movements proved tragically naive. The Middle East's new masters, mandates and unfulfilled promises. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire led to a dramatic redrawing of the Middle East. Under the mandate system, as discussed in Chapter 13, Britain and France assumed direct control over vast new territories. Britain controlled Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. France took Syria and Lebanon. This arrangement brought the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 into grim reality, fundamentally thwarting the hopes of a unified, independent Arab state that had been promised by Britain during the war in exchange for their revolt against the Ottomans. Moreover, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, set the stage for an intractable conflict between Zionist and Arab nationalisms, a struggle exacerbated by British administration. These were profound, big lies, of unfulfilled promises and hidden agendas, sowing seeds of conflict that continue to define the Middle East to this day. The road to another war, how World War I made World War II inevitable. The Great War, therefore, did not truly end. It merely transformed, leaving a legacy of unhealed wounds that would fester and erupt into an even more devastating global conflict. The direct causal links between the unresolved issues of World War I and the outbreak of World War II are undeniable. The punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the war guilt clause and crippling reparations, fueled deep-seated German resentment and humiliation, providing the perfect breeding ground for Adolf Hitler's rise to power and his promises of overturning the treaty. The economic instability stemming from war debts and reparations, culminating in the Great Depression, created the social and political chaos in which extremist ideologies like Nazism and Fascism could flourish, offering radical solutions to desperate populations. The failure of the League of Nations, critically weakened by the US's absence and its own structural weaknesses, meant there was no effective international body to deter aggression or enforce collective security in the face of rising militarism. The unresolved grievances of ethnic minorities in newly formed states, coupled with the unfulfilled national aspirations of Italy and Japan, who felt slighted by the peace, and the perception of injustice, provided ready-made pretexts for revisionist powers to challenge the post-war order. The bitter peace that followed the Great War was, in essence, an intermission. The unhealed wounds of conflict, injustice, and economic chaos were left to fester, creating a world teetering on the edge. The biggest big lie of all was that such a war could ever truly end without sowing the seeds of its successor. The world had witnessed an unprecedented cataclysm, yet it had failed to learn its most crucial lessons, condemning itself to a future that would soon explode with even greater ferocity. The stage was set for the next act, a play of even greater horror.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please don't forget to like, comment and share this video. Also don't forget to subscribe the channel and press the bell icon, so that you don't miss out the next video. For now, you can continue with the next video or can go through the complete playlist provided here.